Welcome to the Seed Family Podcast,
where we explore natural, homeschooling, gentle parenting,
simple living, and family adventure.
I'm Rachel Rainbolt, the Sage Parenting Coach, coming to you from the Pacific Northwest, where I live wild and free in connection with my 3 wildlings and the Papa Bear in our fixer-upper on the beach. This is episode 76, and today I'm here with Julie Bogart talking about critical thinking. Julie is a mom of 4 grown homeschoolers, creator of the online writing program Brave Writer, and author of the books The Brave Learner and Raising Critical Thinkers. Today she lives in Cincinnati, Ohio, and can be found sipping a cup of tea while planning her next visit to one of her globe-trotting kids. So join us around the campfire and let's get living the family life of our dreams. To consider Julie a friend, and after enjoying such a wonderful conversation with her in episode 26, she's back again, this time to talk about critical thinking.
Woohoo!
Back again. For any follower of mine, you really need no introduction, but for the new listeners joining us today, will you introduce yourself and share a bit about who you are and what you're passionate about?
Oh, I would happily do that. So I'm Julie Bogart. I have 5 grown kids. The youngest is 25. The oldest is almost 35. I don't even know what that means. And I live in Cincinnati, Ohio. I've been here for 22 years. I grew up in Southern California, and I have lived in multiple places around the globe. I am a homeschooling advocate, and I was a homeschooling mother. I homeschooled all my kids for 17 years, and I have experienced public high school for my children. Various ones went to college. Some have gone to grad school, and I'm here to tell you it can work.
I love that. Everyone should be following people like sort of in the future seasons, of the path that you're on. It is so tremendously reassuring and inspiring. So thank you for just living out loud and being you.
Oh, you're welcome. It's good to be here. I love your show. I love the vibe that you've generated in your community. And I aspire to having one corner of my home as minimalistically decorated as your whole house is.
Oh, thank you, my friend.
I'm like, well, if I can just do this one drawer the way Rachel would do it, I'm on the right track.
Just one drawer. That is a win.
It would be. For me, it is.
All right, so let's start by defining what is critical thinking. It seems like an obvious question, but it's sort of like recently when they asked members of the government to define what is a woman. Like it seems like a really simple question, but then it gets very complicated very fast. So what is critical thinking, Julie?
Yeah, I love that you ask it because it does help if we share definitions. And in fact, in all conversations, it's really helpful to define the terms everybody is using because the same word can mean a million different things depending on who's talking and what their background is. So when I thought about critical thinking, I was thinking about a person's ability to evaluate the information or evidence or ideas or facts coming at them and to notice their own bias as it kicks into gear. In other words, it's not just about figuring out how wrong the other guy is. It's actually being aware of the impact of information on you, how you get defensive or reactionary or depressed or triumphant, right? How is your bias a part of this journey of thinking? And then critical thinking includes considering a variety of perspectives, even the ones that make you uncomfortable, so that you come to the point where you can render a possible verdict. In other words, what you believe to be true for now. Yes. As we all know, our ideas and our attitudes and our beliefs are constantly being revised. Even if you hold to a similar belief as the one you had last year, a year's worth of experiences and data will modify it, will add nuance, might even commit you to it more. But rarely do we just stay in one place for all time, forever and amen.
Yes, I love how you add that for now. So why is it important to think critically? Like, what effects are we seeing of a population that does not think critically?
Oh my goodness. Well, the biggest problem with not thinking critically is that we are susceptible to following people who claim to have the authority to lead us. And I actually have a problem with the term leadership in general. The older I get, the more aware I am that everybody is as flawed as I am. I remember Michelle Obama making an amazing statement after President Obama was elected. She said, I suddenly realized that all the people in the room weren't always as smart as we think they are. Like, you think, well, I've elected them to this office and they've gone to these schools. They must be really smart. But actually, they're human beings. And they are also shaped and twerked and morphed by their own experiences, education, and backgrounds. So to me, critical thinking enables us to humanize everybody. It helps us see people in their complete humanity, not just as idiots or I was going to use a few more pejorative terms that I hear, but I think they're harmful for people who are disabled. But we have a string of language that we use to characterize the other side as evil. And we do that to pretend as though we are not also susceptible to being misled, to being guided by unverified science, to being blinded to our own bias that is preventing us from thinking well. So critical thinking is a tool for recognizing the humanity in all of us, including more perspectives in the conversation and accounting for all of those perspectives in our solutions.
Yes. Oh, so good and so important. And as you're talking, it reminded me that years ago when we got together, there was a small group of us and we went out for dinner and there were some parents of trans kids in that circle.
Oh, yeah.
And you asked, first you asked for permission to ask some uncomfortable questions so that you could challenge some beliefs and ideas and some thinking that you had on the issue. And we all consented and you asked some really like uncomfortable, but in the best way kinds of questions and really like in front of us kind of wrestled with our answers and kind of, like we could like see you like integrating like the new pieces that we were offering that you were picking up. So I just want to say for what it's worth that like personally, I have witnessed in action you working through this critical thinking process that you talk about in this book.
Wow. I really appreciate you reminding me of that dinner because I have referenced it in more times than you would even be aware. Those conversations were so powerful. Recently, I was in a conversation with one of my family members and we don't see eye to eye on politics. And he told me that I was getting all my information from the wrong news sources. And that's why I did not have good information. And I said back to him, I said, oh, that's so funny that you think I get my information from news because I actually rarely do. I sometimes watch the nightly news just for information, like what happened in the world today. But if I want to know something, that's not where I go for my data. And he said, well, if you don't go to the news, where do you go? And I said, to people. And it was like a pause that followed. He's like, people? I was like, yeah. So if there's an issue that I don't understand, and you brought up a really good one, what to do about children under age 16 who are showing that they are trans, what do I do with those questions? I have to talk to people who are actually impacted by the consequences of decisions that would alter the experience of their own lives. Too often we're in this sort of theoretical construct for people we never have to talk to. And then we organize them in our very sort of safe journey brains, right? I can take this little safe journey And I can imagine what it must be like for them from this very safe vantage point of my non-being like them. And then I offer a solution that's very neat and tidy. And then we expect the other person to just convert and accept it. And that's why we're in this sort of deep stew today where critical thinking has failed us. We're so busy reading and assimilating information and listening to the news, and we're not meeting each other anymore. We're not in community with other human beings to hear how the very same experience of America feels to them, because it's not identical. It's not identical.
Oof, that was so good. So what are those roadblocks? Like, what gets in the way? Where's the resistance? What forces work against critical thinking?
The most primary of all is our loyalty to our people. And we all have communities that shape our thinking. Some are very obvious communities, like a religious group, a political party, maybe even the cable news channel that you listen to. These become the communities where we feel that we have identity and camaraderie and sort of that factual support. Well, if they believe it, I can believe it and not be an idiot, right? There's a feeling that someone else is doing the due diligence and I don't have to work quite as hard because so many of us have all got the same beliefs. So when we hear those kinds of from on high perspectives from our communities, we know that we're risking membership if we go against the set of beliefs that are common to this group. That can also show up in our families, children wanting to please parents. And obviously, as adults, we even experience it with our older parents, where they disapprove, for instance, of a homeschooling decision you make. Well, now you have to decide, which is it? Am I going with this new belief I have or pleasing my parent? That's the kind of loyalty decision that is exerting undue pressure on our ability to think clearly and well. So where I start in raising critical thinkers is with that self-awareness, kind of identifying what's at stake every time I'm faced with a discussion about a topic that makes me question my loyalty to my community, because we all have it.
Yes.
It's very hard.
That perceived threat to the sense of belonging.
Correct. And honestly, also sometimes to your right to exist. So for instance, homeschoolers in particular, I'll use them because they're a very safe group for us to talk about on this podcast. But homeschoolers have a very hard time accepting that child abuse happens in homeschooling families because they feel very protective of homeschooling as a right. And they don't want any data to get out there that would thwart their right to continue to home educate their not child abused children.
Yes.
But if we ignore the stories of people who are now grown-ups, who grew up in families where child abuse was a part of the warp and woof of homeschooling, the current generation of homeschooler is in danger of repeating or creating their own version that is later rejected by their offspring. If we don't use dissent in our groups as a clarifying tool for growth, we risk ideological purity, which eventually leads to all kinds of mind control and denial of harm, and, ultimately will cause a church, an organization, a political party, a political action group to collapse.
Oh, yes.
It'll collapse in on itself.
So much. Yes. I see a lot of this like in the neurodiversity movement too, like coming from the community of therapists, like when I was first coming up and feeling rumblings and stirrings that a lot of the things that we were doing were not serving the people we were supposed to be serving very well. Going straight to the source of like grown adults who had been through these treatments and like talking to them and reading the things that they write and reading books, that they're putting out and sitting down with them and asking them questions. That was uncomfortable for me, as it like threatened my sense of belonging in that therapeutic community, but at the same time was instrumental in helping me to think critically about that issue.
Well, I think what happens is it feels so good to have agreement because it's exhausting to have to challenge every thought you have.
Yes.
Is that snow or is that sleet? Like at some point you just want to be able to just make a declaration and not have somebody ask you, but have you thought about it more deeply? Right. So we really do love our agreement communities. And I always recommend that you keep some around you.
Yeah.
Like I'd rather be in a homeschool support group that supports homeschool, not that tears it down. But the flip side is, what do you do with dissent? Is dissent a disqualifier? So for instance, if you are trying to join a certain homeschool group and they have a criteria for joining, a lot of them are religious criteria.
Yeah.
What happens if you question one of those beliefs, or the denomination you're a part of sees it slightly differently, or you go through a crisis in your own personal belief structure? Are you now going to lose all of your friends for your children, for yourself? What happens when you are required to believe certain things is that it drives disagreement or unbelief underground. But that's going to surface because, as I like to say, you can't cheat the dark gods. So what you actually think, what you actually feel, what you actually believe will eventually come to the surface and put all of those things at risk. A great example of this is the injunction to never say the word divorce in a marriage, because we don't ever want to tolerate the possibility of divorce. Well, if the marriage is experiencing the kinds of damaging behaviors that cause divorces, and divorce isn't in the vocabulary, the person is learning to tolerate what should never be tolerated in the name of not getting divorced. So if you think about it, you're actually not doing the things that will protect the marriage if you're afraid to recognize that there are some circumstances that require divorce. And that's true in every single group. So if you're in a group that doesn't welcome dissent, you're actually in an ideological space that is, I don't want to call it a cult, but it's using cult style properties to create agreement.
Yes.
Agreement should be freely chosen. It should not be required.
Amen. And I would argue from the perspective of someone whose background is in marital and family therapy that the marital relationship, just looking at that example specifically, benefits from being a relationship of choice, like
Yes.
knowing that freedom is there to leave, like then that frees you up to choose to this person every day in those
and
hard
it gives
moments.
That's right. And it gives you the possibility of growth, right?
Yeah.
Because otherwise you're afraid. We see it in homeschoolers all the time. They align with a certain philosophy of education, whether it's unschooling or Charlotte Mason or classical. And then they're in one of those spaces and they bring up a resource or a class or a style of learning that suddenly works for them that is not on the menu of options for that specific philosophy. And suddenly everybody is telling you, well, the reason the philosophy didn't work is because you didn't do it right. So they blame the person who just found a solution.
Yes.
And instead of saying, how cool, you found the solution that's not on our menu of options, we're so happy for you, they say things like, well, you're not a real unschooler.
Yep.
Or you're not a real Charlotte Mason person. And what that does is it makes people do really weird things. I will share with you a weird thing it made me do. So I remember when I was trying to understand how unschooling worked, and I was really struggling with things like bedtimes and chores, which, by the way, aren't really related to academics. So I think it's interesting that unschooling became so comprehensive. It applied to every aspect of life. But at the time, what I noticed was I stopped posting in this email group about the things that I knew were out of alignment with their belief structure. And I only shared things that were. And then what I felt at home was a huge amount of guilt because I thought I was lying by not sharing what wasn't working. And so eventually the pressure of being out of alignment with my integrity, which is how I saw it, meant that I actually changed practices that were working with us to align with the practices that didn't work for us in order to retain membership in this group so I could keep posting and feel good about it.
Yes. To belong.
Yes, just to belong, just to be approved of, just to believe that there was a method and this method was the right one. And of course, that's not how it worked out. I had one kid who at the end of that year was like, can I go to school? Like, he wanted structure. He wanted competition. He wanted grades. He wanted to measure his progress every day. I took that away from him. That's what he wanted. This is the kid who ended up at Columbia Law School. So he wasn't kidding. It was actually a part of his temperament. It wasn't because I unschooled incorrectly. And I think we've got to recognize that when we hold ourselves to standards other people set, we're just literally erecting a prison for ourselves with our own hands.
That's so true. I think that like belonging piece is really huge. I know like the unschooling community can be quite dogmatic, and I will often have people write to me and say things like, my daughter loves doing worksheets. Like, are we not doing unschooling right? Like, can I let her do worksheets if she enjoys them? I'm like, yes. And you still want to call yourself an unschooler? Yes, do it. You're unschooling. Like this is what works for you. Whatever labels feel right for you, do it. Whatever works for your family, do it. Like, yes, if it's my permission, that can be the difference to like calm that threat of exclusion of like, being banished, then please, everyone listening, know that you have my permission to do what works for your family, and you can still wear whatever label feels most authentic for you.
Well, it's interesting because I remember there being a long discussion in this one Facebook group I was a part of. There was a mom whose daughter really wanted to go to school, and it was her last child. And so she was wrestling with losing her identity as an unschooler if this child went to school. But based on the unschooling philosophy, we're supposed to follow the lead of the child. Yep. And if they choose something for themselves, it should be valuable. Yep. Well, instead of someone saying, and this is what I wanted to say to her, once an unschooler, always an unschooler, that philosophy lives inside of you. You're honoring it now with your daughter. And no, you won't be doing your education from home, and it will not look like what we typically think of a curriculum-free unschooling life. The person that you have been and the person that you are is the one that is giving your daughter this opportunity to make this new choice. So yes, you are still welcome here. Everything you've learned is interesting to us, and we want to find out what you learn on this new journey. Okay, that's not what was said. What was said was, for the sake of clarity, unschooling must be defined as a child who is not in a traditional school, even if they chose it, and that she was not free now to post anymore because her child was not in an unschooling context, and the only people allowed to post had to be actively unschooling.
Oh my God.
She was devastated. She had been a huge contributor to this community. In fact, I think that might be the day I actually left this group. And I started asking myself, what are we afraid of? What are we afraid of? Can't we just contend for unschooling as a radical philosophy and let people in? When I was a La Leche League leader, there were people pumping, using bottles, pacifiers, and I was still contending for breastfeeding. And they came into my space knowing this is a breastfeeding space, but I didn't tell them they weren't allowed to be there if they were using a bottle, because otherwise they don't ever get the benefit of any of the breastfeeding because they're not doing it 100% perfectly.
Yes. Oh my God. I agree with all of that. And that is heartbreaking. And yes, I mean, what unschooling is, if you distill it all down, it's just like respecting what your actual human child in front of you needs, allowing them to take the lead. And yes, correct. Yeah, and my oldest is in college now. She's 16, so she's in school, and she still considers herself an unschooler. And my middle child, who will be starting high school in the fall, because for a lot of really good reasons, he thought that would best fit him in this season of life. And I completely agree. And actually, I just had a really interesting conversation with him the other day where I asked him, like, what do you think will be different trying out school as an unschooler versus like starting high school, as someone who came up through the traditional schooling system? And he had some really beautiful insights, like about how, like, every day when he shows up, he knows that he's there by choice, like he's choosing to show up. And each assignment that he does or lecture that he listens to, he's there because he wants to be, and he's thinking about like what he wants to take from that experience and what about it matters to him, and like all these beautiful answers that, yes, like sort of are affirming, like he can wear whatever label he wants, whether that's an unschooler or not, and like we're still doing this right.
Well, exactly, because the goal in any education and parenting objective is for our children to take responsibility for their lives.
Yes.
You know, a lot of people say we're raising them to be adults. Well, you know, I know a lot of adults who still don't take responsibility for their lives. Our hope is that our children will have an increasing sense that they have meaningful jurisdiction over their own lives, that they make the calls, and that they will have the resources and support they need to make those calls and to take back those calls, to go to school and quit. You know, Noah tried school and didn't like it and quit. And then he went to college and tried it and quit. And then he tried college again and quit. And then he tried college again and quit. You know, they get to make those calls.
Yes.
And it's not up to us to feel like we're failing or overly successful by how it turns out. You know, Jacob, my middle child, he got a full ride to Columbia Law School, which, you know, all these parents love to point out to me, like, what a triumph. I mean, I had very little to do with it.
Yes,
you know,
yes.
He was homeschooled through 9th grade. And then from then on out, it was all Jake. I mean, he's the one who got himself to space camp selling cookies. Like I'm riding sidecar.
Yes.
The thing I didn't do is discourage him or talk him out of things or tell him he couldn't do it or that was too big of a reach. But really, each child, knowing they'll still be in a good relationship with you, no matter what their choices are, that is a pretty powerful model. And unfortunately, that's not how most of us, including me, start out parenting.
Yeah.
We have this vision of who we think they're going to be. And then we start, you know, maneuvering them in that direction.
Yeah.
And the ones who have the most courage and some freedom will challenge you on your perception very early or around 13 and forward.
Their alignment with that idealized vision that we have is what we believe might serve as validation, like for all of our hard work and our identities. Yes,
completely.
And we must think critically about that.
Well, right. I mean, absolutely. In fact, one of the things that I think parents fail to do is to think about their relationship with their own parents. And I think it's really instructive. I did this in a conference several years ago. I don't know if you're at this one, Rachel, but I had everybody close their eyes and think back to one of the most challenging moments for them as a child with their own parents. So think back to an argument or a boundary they set or a rule that they had or some vision that they expected this child to live up to, and to actually re-experience the pain that caused, the feeling of not being trusted, not being known, being controlled, being used for validation of the parent. And I really wanted them to be in touch with that. And I invite our listeners to try this on their own after we end this podcast, because it's that feeling that when you fully are aware of it, you can willfully choose not to create in your children. You know, so when you see this reaction occur, you know, I had Noah listening to heavy metal and I was so afraid of it. And so was his father. And, you know, it led to a pretty abusive moment in our parenting where we really yelled at him and shamed him and blamed him and mistreated him. And then I realized with just cutting clarity, oh, I don't live in his brain. I can say you aren't allowed to listen to this music, but that music's already inside his head. Yeah. He's already heard it. It's too late. I can't control this. So I either get to be in a relationship with this human being who loves heavy metal, or I can drive it underground and he can just bide his time till he escapes me. Yes. Those are pretty much the two main options.
Absolutely. Okay, so one other thing I want to touch on before we move on from these roadblocks to critical thinking is that kids come hardwired to form beliefs based on evidence. Yes, like that's why they're always gathering data through those sensory experiences, like trying to touch everything, or even like babies, right? Like putting things in their mouth,
right?
But also through authority. what the people in power tell them, and tradition, what everyone around them has been doing. And I know in several of your examples, you mentioned these things. Kids come with brains wired this way to help increase their chances of survival. So I always try and look at that evolutionary perspective. If mom says run when we see a tiger and we watch everyone else around us take off running, we are more likely to survive. If we can adopt that belief when we see a tiger, we should run. But we are meant to develop beyond that. So I think it's helpful to understand like why we have these inclinations or these instincts, like that threat to belonging, the, having that authority, like belief, that tradition belief. Like it's so helpful to understand why we have that and where that comes from. And then it helps us to be able to evolve beyond it.
No, I love that because it's certainly hardwired. I mean, you're right. There's nothing inherently wrong with wanting an authority to give you instructions. In fact, one of the things that I've really recognized in a lot of these conversations, there are just too many fields of study where I am not an expert to understand and acknowledge and render some kind of a verdict, right? Like I'm not a doctor. So I don't know all of the medically indicated moments when I should take a certain drug. I don't know all of the symptoms of every disease. So I go to a doctor to get the information I don't have. But now I'm faced with a dilemma. How do I know what a good doctor is if I'm not skilled enough to evaluate the medical recommendations a doctor makes? So what ends up happening, whether it's medicine, science, politics, religion, because we don't feel skillful in all those areas, we end up subscribing to what I call the cable package of beliefs and experts we trust, right? Yes. So our church will tell us, well, these are the experts we like. Here are the politicians we agree with. Here are the science people that make the most sense given our beliefs.
Yes.
So now you don't have to vet anybody because we've already got this nice list for you and you can just exclude anyone who's not on the list.
Yes, or political party or homeschool affiliation.
There you go. It's literally every group. And it starts with the family. And this is why I always say critical thinking starts at home, because we do this with our children. Oh, no, don't watch that show. Watch this one. Oh, no, this is a good book. That book isn't so good. Oh, we love this music in our family. This music we don't listen to. Oh, these movies are only for people 16 and over. I'm going to turn the, movie backwards so you can't see the cover. I had someone ask me to do that so her daughter wouldn't see that we watch movies that adults watch, right? Like that's the kind of stuff that we do. We're curating our children's worlds for them, using our authority to vet who they're allowed to welcome into their brains. And we are so used to that life that we all live that way. So what ends up happening, and this happened to me in like late 1999, early 2000, I was reading sort of a new blog. Blogs were pretty new at that point. Maybe it was 2001. And somebody from the opposite position on a social issue than the one I currently had called themselves as the ones having the moral high ground. I was so stunned that the people on the opposite side of this issue didn't know they were immoral. I mean, I knew they had a different position, but I just assumed they knew they were immoral. They were just justifying it for a whole host of criteria, but they knew fundamentally it was an immoral position. For them to say they weren't only moral, but they had the moral high ground, meaning my side was the immoral side. I don't know why. That just took me so by surprise. It sent me on like a 2 or 3 year mission where I just started checking out books for the position I don't hold. Because I thought, well, maybe I need to hear it in first person.
Yes.
Not the way my side describes it, but the way they would describe it for themselves. And the conclusion I came to, conclusion's a strong word, but the realization that I had after 2 years of reading was, holy smokes, we're not even talking about the same thing. The two sides aren't two sides. They're two causes. One is championing the cause of one group of people, and the other is championing the cause of who they believe is being violated. And they're talking past each other. So the arguments that they're creating to bolster their side are literally bouncing off like Teflon for the other side, because the other side isn't even accounting at all for this issue that the opposing forces consider the heart of the issue. And I think that was super instructive for me. I was like 41, 42 years old. And I suddenly was like, so how many issues are like this?
You've uncorked that genie bottle. You can't put it back in.
Right. And I always say the 40s are like the fluctuating decade. You know, the 30s are when you've got it all figured out and you've decided you can do it better than your parents. And then the 40s are like, holy shoot, what just happened? You know, it's like, oh my gosh, that no longer makes sense. And this is confusing and conflicting. And, you know, relationships start to morph. And so, yeah, for me, that was really a big pivot moment. And I think I've been in search of how we think well ever since, because I felt so misled. That
was such a good illustration of like how we can get ourselves there, how we can overcome those roadblocks and grow ourselves into critical thinkers. How do we raise our children to be critical thinkers?
So it definitely starts by being one yourself. And one of the biggest challenges of writing this book is that I really did know that if the adult isn't good at critical thinking, their child has no chance, right? So I had to sort of teach the parent while I was telling them how to teach their kids.
Yes.
And I've heard back from so many adults who've said to me, oh my gosh, this has been valuable for my own growth as a thinker. And I'm like, yay, because that was the first part of the goal.
That was literally my first thought when I saw what the title of your next book was going to be, Raising Critical Thinkers. My first thought was become a critical thinker. That's
yes,
step one.
Yes, it is. And of course, it comes from self-awareness. It's
Yes.
not just being able to identify which logical fallacy applies to this argument. It's actually considering how attached you are to all the beliefs you currently hold.
Yes.
How willing are you to consider additional perspectives, especially the ones that make you annoyed, angry, short of breath, feeling a flash of frustration, judgmental? You know, those are the ones. Like for me, if I'm on Facebook and somebody posts an article and it's by an author that I've already decided is a terrible human being, I know that I'm in my reactivity when I feel smug. Smugness is a huge clue to me. So it's like, oh, what an idiotic thing to write. You know, oh, feeling a little smug, are you? Think this person doesn't have internal logical coherence, do you? I mean, we all do. All of our ideas make perfect sense to the person holding them, even murderers.
Yeah.
Their most logical assessment is that eliminating this other person is the best decision I can come up with.
Yeah.
So even when we disagree, there is a logical coherence to the belief structure of another person. And that's where I try to start. So with children, then, we urge it by including varieties of perspectives, by identifying who is telling the story that we're receiving right now, through whose mouth, through whose experience, through whose education or expertise. Because if we don't start there, kids, like all of us, receive information uncritically. It's a fire hose of information. So you can be scrolling along and this person that you've always trusted to be pretty logical and reasonable. This happened a lot during COVID, by the way. They suddenly are saying something that is to you off the wall, right?
Mm-hmm.
So for a minute, we have to pause. And this is true with our children when we're reading books about history or science or philosophy or anything that sort of gets at sort of a core idea or understanding of human existence. We want our kids to start to be able to situate the storytellers in their context, in their frame of reference. Why does this person, who I usually agree with, why are they saying something that right now feels off the wall? Where's that coming from? How did they arrive at that point? How come I didn't arrive there also? Those are places to begin with kids.
Such important work.
I think like I've found there are two questions that I find like the more I ask them, the more space I create for critical thinking in my children. One of them is Says Who.
Yes.
One of my favorite children's books, it's actually sitting on the bookshelf right behind me, is The True Story of the Three Little Pigs. So I was delighted to see this story referenced in your new book. And this children's book provided such a fun way to introduce the Says Who component of critical thinking to my own children. But it's essentially to ask like, how might the story be different if told from a different perspective? So I will often ask my kids, even now, like when the big ones are teenagers, they'll come tell me something as fact, and I'll just say, "Oh, says who?" And they sort of know that shorthand for like, what would the other people involved, like what would their perspective be? Like, whose narrative is this? Who's on the authority of whose narrative is this fact being pulled from,
How might this story be different if told by one of the other characters?
I'm so glad that you brought that up, because obviously that is the perfect opening. And that is where I start. And I loved that book. And I remember very clearly when I would retell The Three Little Pigs to Noah all the time, the day that we introduced the big bad wolf and his perspective, he was sort of stunned by it. Like, wait, another perspective even exists. Well, fast forward to a more interesting moment. I was sharing my book with my staff, many of whom are formerly homeschooled and they're in their 30s. And they all said that and that's the same age as my oldest son, when they first heard that book, they thought that was the true story. A couple of them said that they didn't even see it as sarcasm. Their parents never spent any time discussing it with them. They literally took the words of the wolf as revealing what really happened. And I thought that was also fascinating, because from an adult perspective, it's obvious satire right out of the gate. I mean, assuming, of course, that the original narrative is the true story. But I found it interesting to think that these adults could reflect back and remember believing it.
Yeah.
And isn't that so? Asking says who, and being able to go one step further and say, well, if the grandmother were to tell the story, what would she say?
Yes.
If the bricks on the third little pig's house could tell the story, what might they say? Like, actually bringing them through a variety of options is, a great beginning point.
Yes.
For that critical thinking. Another activity that I recommend in the book, which is probably my favorite one in the book, has to do with using grammar analysis for critical thinking. So a lot of times we end up thinking that when we're talking about thinking, that we're talking about politics. And most people, when they first heard I was writing this book, were like, so what side's it going to be on? Conservative or liberal? Is it about politics? Are you a Republican or a Democrat? I was like, it's not about politics. There aren't even politics in the book.
Yeah.
I mean, that's not the goal of the book. So when I was designing the exercises, I was like, how can we apply these skills to benign topics that kids are encountering in school every day through rote memorization? And of course, inside of Brave Writer, one of the things that we try to help people do is have a direct experience of grammar. So in other words, instead of simply teaching, okay, a noun is a person, place, thing, or idea, an adjective describes a noun, person, place, thing, or idea, we actually give them opportunities to analyze language and make their own judgment calls. My favorite experience that I did with my own kids is we took Lewis Carroll's poem Jabberwocky, which is filled with invented language.
Mm-hmm.
And we analyzed the meanings of the words. We relied on the sound of the word, 'twas brillig and the slithy tobes. Like, 'twas brillig. Well, what is that? 'Twas brillig. So then we start riffing. Okay, well, we know 'twas the night before Christmas. So maybe brillig means night. Yeah, it could be like it was night. But brillig doesn't sound like night, and it sounds sort of like brilliant. Maybe it means morning. And then somebody says, 'twas brillig. Well, maybe it just means was bright. It was bright. Well, now one of those words, morning, and one of those words, bright, they're totally different. One is a noun, one's an adjective. And suddenly you're like, oh, so when we say it was, we can add a descriptor or a noun. And suddenly we're like doing the investigative work around language.
Yes.
That's critical thinking. And you're asking yourself, how am I being influenced by the sound of the letters and the fact that it's using old time language like 'twas, and the fact that it is 2 syllables instead of 1, right? And you find yourself really down the rabbit hole. Haha, Lewis Carroll.
Yeah.
Right?
Yes.
But that fosters the set of questions, because critical thinking is just better questions. It's just better and better framing of asking those questions. So if you're wanting to do it in sort of a low threat way, starting with grammar is a great way to begin, as opposed to issues. Kids don't have opinions on issues in third grade. They don't know enough, but they can certainly look at a poem and start asking, when you hear the words slithy tobes, does that sound like a reliable thing or an unreliable thing? Discuss, like.
Yes, I was reading a book with my youngest. He's 10 now, and it was a couple of years ago, and they used the word uncivilized in the context of coming into contact with some indigenous tribe. And I paused and I said, what do you think they mean by the word uncivilized? And without missing a beat, he said, not white.
Oh, wow. Wow. Amazing. Yeah.
Like that was just honest, innocent, like from reading a lot of history setting books. Like that was the meaning of the word that he had interpreted, which felt so powerful to me.
I just said, interesting. What else is different about the narrator and this group of people they're describing? And he came up with other answers too, like they don't have advanced weapons.
Well, absolutely. But let's go down that rabbit hole with you for a minute. So he's your child. He has been sitting at your dinner tables. He's been listening to you and your husband talk. And so he has internalized that. What will be interesting is if it alters when he's 20.
Yeah.
If he looks at it in yet another way, because that is sort of a breakthrough understanding of the most modern moment in time, isn't it? So those books are a lot of times not that old. I was sharing inside Raising Critical Thinkers about Laura Ingalls Wilder. Her children's literature award, named after her, was only stripped of her name in 2018. But her first book came out in 1932, I think it was. And, Little House on the Prairie has the line, no, a dead Indian is a good Indian, or a good Indian is a dead Indian. In Little Town on the Prairie, there is this breathless buildup to a minstrel show with blackface that Pa engages in. Those are both completely unacceptable ways to talk about Indigenous or Black Americans today. And yet it took till 2018 before we had enough of a change of heart culturally to remove her name from that award and to alert people that those values really are inappropriate inside children's literature. So I am fascinated repeatedly with how interpretations change over time and are responsive to the moments we live in. I like to say that interpretation is manna. It's 24 hours long. It lasts for a day.
Oh, that's so true. Okay. One of the second question that I find helpful asking my kids is based on what? So like says who and based on what? Like one of my older articles titled Pediatricians Are Not Gods. I arm new parents with a question based on what, to empower them to just critically evaluate the recommendations being given to them by pediatricians. Because my experience was that a lot of pediatricians give out a lot of advice based on just personal experience. So I started asking like, based on what? Like on what are you basing that recommendation? But we can offer this tool to our children as well when they state things as facts that we want to gently encourage them to question. So my kids will often come to me with like fully formed, crystallized conclusions about things and just asking like, based on what? Like with authentic curiosity. Like I'm genuinely curious about where that came from. Like it really, they start, kind of scratching at it and it starts to like disintegrate right before your eyes. So I love those two questions. I found really helpful, like says who and based on what. And then of course I ask them of myself as well.
Along with who benefits from me believing this?
No, those are great questions. And getting people to sort of identify their sources and then discuss the source. You can ask, why is this source meaningful to you? Why do you trust? How do you trust? Who told you to trust? Those are great questions too. I know for me, I grew up with in the 70s in Southern California with a father who's a personal injury attorney and a mother who was a health nut, really back when all of that stuff was first getting going. So I was involved with a lot of alternative health and learned a lot about, my mom made us read labels. So red dye number 2, EDTA, right? Like my first debate topic was why EDTA should be banned from all consumable foods. And my first essay was about why raw milk should be allowed to be sold and not banned. And Altadena Dairy was in some kind of a big lawsuit. And then, of course, I grew up with my dad telling horror stories of medical malpractice at the dinner table. So I have a very robust sense of non-trust when it comes to medical practices that we all accept as common. And then in my 50s, I have had a ruptured small intestine emergency surgery on a holiday weekend. I broke my ankle on a holiday weekend. I concussed my head on a holiday weekend. And I broke my shoulder on a holiday weekend. So I was with emergency medical personnel for all of those in an ER, no time to vet the doctors, no time to do my due diligence. And the first one was literally life-threatening. The intestine ruptured and I was going into sepsis. And so they rushed me to the hospital. And when I found out I had to have surgery, I burst into tears crying because my bias was you cannot trust doctors, particularly emergency surgery, because you haven't done your due diligence and they're going to make a mistake and you'll pay for it forever. So I called my father. I'm just telling this long-winded story to show you how things evolve. I call my dad. I tell him I'm in this circumstance and how he's ruined the way I think about doctors forever. And he came back and he said, you know, Julie, I'll just tell you this. Of the two professions, lawyers and doctors are 10 times more ethical and reliable. And then he said, it's emergency surgery. You're going to have it. And you're going to have to trust this doctor. Just ask the nurses if they like him. And if they respond enthusiastically, good enough.
Yes.
And it was such a shocking moment for me to realize I was going to have to trust that I don't have all the answers, all the information, all the data. I did ask. These nurses seemed enthusiastic. The guy did a great job. So I did come out of it fine. My ankle was repaired by a hand specialist, right? Like these things happen. Yes. We think we have so much more control than we do. So we do our due diligence. We ask our questions, but there will be moments where you are rolling the dice and you are trusting. And I think part of critical thinking is just being aware of when you're rolling the dice and trusting versus when you've had the opportunity to do those deep dives and draw really good conclusions for yourself. But we can't always. Not every circumstance allows for it. So what can we do? We can be humble. We can go in and accept some responsibility for not having all the answers, for not knowing for sure.
Yes, that's the rub. Like we can't be critical thinking in every moment, in every decision, in every interaction, 24 hours a day in all situations. We can't. So trying to discern when to challenge and question and when we have to just trust can certainly be tricky.
So tricky. And so with our children, you know, we want a balance of those two things. Like we want to give them the opportunity to think critically. One of the things you asked was, you know, well, what do we do with kids? One of the examples that's not in the book that I've been sharing recently looks like this. So let's say you've got a 5 or a 6-year-old and it's time for dinner. And you say to your child, okay, time to wash your hands. And then your child is like, I don't want to wash my hands. What most of us do is we do not see this as a critical thinking moment. We see it as an opportunity for the parental propaganda program, right?
Authority.
That's right. We're going to draw on the authorities we have, which is science. And we're going to say to our child, well, actually, you have to wash your hands because these things called germs, which are invisible to the naked eye, are clinging to your hands right now. And if they get on the food and get in your stomach, they're going to make you sick. So you have to wash your hands. Isn't that we might not give them all that detail, but that's what we're saying. That's the reason that we believe so ferociously in hand washing. And especially like during COVID, we were obsessed with it. But then your kid comes back and says, I still don't want to wash my hands. Like they haven't been persuaded. They have some other reason they don't want to wash their hands. And the truth is, didn't they just eat 6 Cheerios off the floor an hour ago and they're not getting sick and you didn't worry about it? Didn't you just suck the grime off your baby's pacifier and stick it back in their mouths? Like you pretend to believe the propaganda, but it's a habit. It's an uninterrogated habit that you are pushing on your child. So when your child gives you the opportunity to interrogate a parental propaganda habit, take it. So you might say to your child, oh, you don't want to wash your hands. Tell me more about that. What's going on here? Is it the water? Is it the coldness, the hot heat? Pull out your thermometer and start measuring the temperature. How does it feel now? Is this a good temperature? Do we need to get it to, 62 every time before you wash your hands? Your child's still unfazed. No, I hate it. I hate it. Oh, is it too wet? Maybe we'll try hand sanitizer. Did you know that like dries really quick? Child's like, no, it's goopy and it's sticky and I hate it. So now you can say, well, here's the thing. I want to get the germs off your hands. You don't seem to care about that. There's one other thing I know kills germs. It's heat. Maybe we'll just blow dry your hands before dinner this week. See how that goes. Do you want to try that? And of course, little kids are going to think that's hilarious. So you may as well try it, right? But then you could also just roll the dice. Okay, let's not wash hands for a week and see how you do. Yeah. Like you could actually get a microscope and do the thing where you make the germs visible and they look and they see the dirt that's on their hand that they can't see. You can look up more information, but this could be an opportunity to give your child a chance to collect data, to have an experience, to report back on that data, to roll the dice and see what an outcome is based on a theory. And a lot of times, so much of what we do as parents is just the propaganda program. It's uninterrogated by us. So when our kids give us an opportunity, another good example, I want to play video games overnight, all night long. Well, that's stupid. You need your sleep. I can't let you do that. But couldn't you? I mean, I did a dance marathon for 72 hours to raise money. Maybe you could say to your kid, you know what? You're on. If you are able to stay awake for all night playing video games, I'm going to donate $5 per hour you stay awake to your favorite charity. Let's do it. You're on. Turn it into something that's actually an opportunity to have the experience, but treat it not like, haha, gotcha. Treat it like something you're excited to discover the result of, right? That you too don't know what the outcome will be, and give them a chance to learn what it means to think well.
Oh, I love that. Whenever I talk through scenarios like that with parents, I always find myself saying this is the work of homeschooling. This is actually what homeschooling is about. It's not about memorizing the year that Columbus set sail. This is what it's actually about, this kind of stuff. Equipping your kids with that neurological structure to evaluate things and to learn how to make good decisions for themselves. This is the reason why we do this right here.
100%. And, they're going to make inconvenient decisions. I had a daughter who wanted to be a vegan. Our household was not vegan. Then 2 of her siblings hopped on the bandwagon. Suddenly I'm shopping for expensive ingredients and buying cookbooks, and we're making 2 or 3 meals a night for the variety of people in the family. I had one kid who was an exclusive carnivore, and the others were all vegans, and the others were in between. And it just became a circus at dinner time. We're all borrowing each other's cutting boards. But interestingly enough, of those 3 who are vegan, only one is today, and he went through a several-year period where he wasn't. One of them is now an omnivore like she used to be, and another one is a vegetarian. So here's what I loved about that period of their lives. They put into practice a belief they wanted to test. And that's the goal. It's not just thinking to think. It's when I think, do I align my behavior with the thoughts I'm having? So if a child says, I really, really care about the homeless, and you don't create an opportunity for your child to care about the homeless, it will not become a part of them, and they will not get a more nuanced, deep understanding of what they care about. Eventually, it will just be a theory. Well, theoretically, I care about homelessness. And that is not the same as actually caring about homelessness.
Yes.
And it can be in any arena. I picked that because it's a social issue. But if a child says, I really don't want to learn math with paper and pencil, same thing. Yeah. Can they learn math without paper and pencil? You're on. That's a great challenge. Let's see how far we can take that.
Yes. Okay. This leads me into the question I am been most looking forward to asking you. If we teach our children the skills of critical thinking, they will think critically about everything, including our beliefs, views, and
Yep.
values, right? Can you speak to that potentially uncomfortable reality?
100%. So first, just remind yourself that the views you held at 15 are not identical to the views you are holding today. Everybody is a human process. We say human beings, but really we're just humans in process. So whatever data and experience we have at any given time forms the foundation for the beliefs we hold now. So we could not know what we did not know at 15, and true for your kids too. They're going to hold some really strong opinions. I remember my son, Jacob, who is a human rights lawyer today. So he's always been interested in issues of human rights. So there was some ballot issue in Ohio where he had a really strong pro opinion, but he was 16 and could not vote yet. So he did all this research. He gathered all of these, articles for me to read, and he sat me down and did almost like a presentation. And I validated the hard work, the research, the data. It was very well put together. And at the end, he said, "So are you going to vote pro?" And I said, "No, I am voting con." And he burst into tears and said, "Mom, I count on you to be logical." Now, he was trying to persuade me because he already knew my view and he had a different view. And I had the opportunity to say back, "Jake, your view has integrity. And there's a huge percentage of people who are going to vote like you. The one question you didn't ask me is why I am voting the way I am, what experiences, data, research I have that makes me feel this way. But honestly, what you've shared moves me a micro millimeter in your direction. I see where you're coming from in a way that I hadn't seen it before. So let's roll the dice and let time go by and see where we are in a few years." And interestingly, there have been issues today, he's 30, so 15 years later, I've been shaped by his understanding because he's a very thoughtful, reflective, deep thinker. I think what's uncomfortable for us is that nobody likes destabilization of their ideas. So we're trying to create a mini community that will affirm what we hold to be true. And we think that our kids' agreement will secure that feeling for us. But you cannot be intimate with someone you are controlling. It is not possible. And agreement does not facilitate intimacy. Intimacy is being known as you are, not for what you think. So creating space in the relationship for your child to think away from you is painful, but it's necessary.
Oh, that was so good. That's definitely going to be the little soundbite for this.
Well, I want to end on a little story for you because I think you'll love this.
Yes, please.
So when I was living in France in college, I babysat for some expatriates who were preparing to be missionaries. And they had 3 kids, so very strong Christians. And I knew their kids when they were like, 6, 4, and 0, like tiny little kids. I did not see this family again, the parents again, until like 25 years later. So now their kids are adults. And I was visiting with the mother. And like I said, she was a really strong religious person. Her husband was a pastor. She was a pastor's wife. So I was asking, how'd your kids turn out? Like they're in their 20s now. How are they? I haven't seen them since they were little babies. And she said, well, 2 of them are doing great, but one of them, quote unquote, does not love the truth. And so I knew what that was. I knew what the code for that was. And I said to her, I said, "Oh, that must be hard for you." And she said, "Well, it really is because we really raised him. And I just pray and hope that he will know the truth." So I said to her, "Well, where is he and what's his job?" And she said, "Well, he lives on the West Coast and he works for Habitat for Humanity." And I about fell out of my chair and I said, "You know what? I think he loves the truth." I think he's literally modeling his life after you.
Yeah.
His religious beliefs have diverged, but clearly your values are living inside your child. And maybe one day he'll circle back around even to the religious beliefs. But right now, from my vantage point, he's a lover of truth. And we had just this really great connection. She hadn't really put it together that way. And I'm not saying this to pat myself on the back, because it isn't that. It's just that I think we sometimes don't see. It would be like if you raise a child and you were a breastfeeding, attachment, nursing your baby, stay-at-home mom, and then that child grew up and decided to become a full-time working mother using daycare and bottles. You might be tempted to feel like everything you taught them had failed. But then if you actually watch the relationship between the mom and this baby, you might notice that they really want the most and best for their child, and they really love that child. And that's the value you share, even though the belief expression is completely different.
That is beautiful. Okay, our final question is about technology. How can we help ourselves and our children interact with technology with our critical thinking caps on?
That's the $1 million question, Rachel. Everybody asks me about video games. Outside of writing, it is the number one question I get: what to do about video games. So I want to pull back the lens a little bit. What if we don't think about video in that equation? What if we just ask the question, what about games? I have yet to meet a parent who's worried that their child is playing too much Monopoly or too much Settlers of Catan or too many card games with a sibling. There's something about a board game or a card game where it sits out on a table and it's away from technology and it's visible by the parent. The parent can walk by and see what the game is. They can overhear the conversation happening between children. It's reassuring. It feels safe. It feels like it's doing good things. We're watching our children roll dice and count. We're watching them calculate money, right? How much to spend, how much to get back in change. We're watching them think about resource management. We're listening to them strategize. And so whenever I talk to a parent about board games, they're all for them. They're willing to stock the basement with board games. But the second you add the word video, the exact opposite reaction occurs, even though the same kinds of skills are being employed in a video game. Suddenly, it's dangerous. It's just entertainment. They're not learning anything. They're in a vulnerable state where this game is going to leave a horrific impression on their imaginations. And to be fair, a lot of board games look pretty innocuous compared to, the blood spurting out of these beasts that are getting shot by a kid in a first-person shooter role. I don't want to minimize how startling that is. That said, there is something about the actual gaming that I would invite us to consider as valuable. Kids apparently, in these longitudinal studies that have now been done over 20 years, use gaming, board games and video games, for emotional regulation. What that means is the student is actually coming to the game when they are feeling tired, upset, stressed, anxious, worried, angry, and they are using the game to reset the emotional thermostat inside their bodies. Similar to how when I was, for instance, going through a divorce and very stressed out and emotionally low, used training for a marathon. I went for runs to reset my emotional thermostat, to regulate my emotions. Gaming offers that kind of experience to kids, particularly boys who were studied. In fact, one study shows that boys who game between 7 and 10 hours a week were better regulated emotionally than kids who did not game at all. I just want to pause for a moment. Do you find that amazing?
Yes, I feel like actually looking at the data, what the actual research and the studies are showing can be really helpful in sort of demystifying the boogeyman persona that technology can often take on when it comes to children. So I love that you're breaking down some of the actual data in this conversation.
I certainly do too. Agreed. Here's the thing. Kids who game are learning resource management, calculation, strategy. They're learning collaboration, often with teammates. Like some of these games, like Halo, require you to join a team when you're online. And so you're learning how to respect the decision-making of a team member, how to work together to achieve a certain goal. Gaming, whether online or on a tabletop, offers some of the most powerful critical thinking skill opportunities of anything they encounter in their lives. Clearly, textbooks do not offer this because textbooks have one right answer. They have one way of thinking that the student is meant to absorb. But games are dynamic, and online video games are especially dynamic. No two gameplays is ever the same. They are constantly navigating the new within the context of the familiar. How powerful. One of the studies that I cited in my book, Raising Critical Thinkers, shows that even some of those games that mothers in particular find kind of horrifying, Mortal Kombat, Resident Evil, Grand Theft Auto, that even those games produced positive effects in the kids who played them. So I want to peel back just for a moment and help you understand a little bit about what it feels like to game from a child's perspective. So, for instance, most kids love the idea of getting to use an adult tool the way an adult uses it, whether it's a hand mixer or a sewing machine or a drill. If you think about the computer through that lens, I think you start to understand its fascination for kids. It's an adult tool. It has controls. And it allows them a level of autonomy they rarely get anymore in today's parenting style. Kids aren't free to play outside without supervision. They're not free to walk to school or walk to the store. They're not free. They are always being monitored to make sure they're safe. So when they get on a computer, it's a new frontier where they get to be a little unsafe, where they get to explore the power of this tool with their autonomy, without a parent dictating their every step. The computer is like driving a car at age 6. That's what it feels like at age 10. And when we say you're not allowed to do this, we're robbing them of risk and adventure, two of the key enchantment forces that lead to the best learning. So what are we supposed to do? Just let our kids play on the computer all day long, all night long, and never go outside to look at a robin building a nest? Absolutely not. But if you are going to ask your child to get off the computer, you better give them something worthy to get off for.
Yes, thank you. I say this all the time. Rather than trying to take away in terms of technology, you need to think about what you need to add first to give them an alternate way of getting whatever need it is that they're getting met through the technology. You need to replace it with something else before you talk about taking it away.
In other words, it's not enough to just limit the computer. Give them other tools. Teach them to sew. Give them a drill. I jokingly say, hand them a book of matches and send them outside.
I love it.
I know some of you will hate that suggestion, but there's a part of me that's like, if you told your kids to go build a bonfire in the backyard, they would get off the computer for that. Do you see what I'm saying? Too often we say, get off the computer and please go be good, sweet children on a couch. Well, I'm sorry. That's not compelling enough for a mind that is hungry to develop. Computer games feed a developing mind the nourishing food that leads to effective strategizing and critical thinking. I'm not kidding. And you want to ensure that when you ask them to set that aside for some other activity, that that activity is worthy, that it compels the same level, or at least approaches the same level of intrigue and fascination. And sometimes that's grabbing the binoculars and going for a hike and looking for birds. Sometimes it is sitting on a couch and getting lost in a fantasy novel. Sometimes it is setting the table and having a poetry tea time. But just asking kids not to be on the computer, to not game, and that's the period at the end of the sentence, that's pretty unfair. That's asking your child to give up their most satisfying experience for a blank, for a nothing, just to appease your anxiety. The last thing I'll say about video gaming, and I think it's important to state, play with your kids, or at least watch them. You would never miss a soccer match when they were on the team. You would never miss a piano recital. In fact, you will stand and listen to a child practicing the trumpet in another room, and you will feel satisfied that your child is doing something important and worthy. Can you transfer that same feeling to a child's success in a game? Can you pull up a chair and let that child know just how much you are eager to see them perform at their capacity? I'm telling you right now, once you start doing that, you will be less afraid of games because you will see them the way you see Settlers of Catan on your kitchen table. And your child will feel freer to tell you the truth about their gaming experience because they know that you value it. So they won't pretend that they love it when they don't. They won't pretend that they're safe when they don't feel safe. They won't pretend that they weren't troubled in their sleep with nightmares because something was too scary. They won't tell you those things if they think you're about to cancel their right to play video games. We've got to get close enough to our kids and the things they love and value so that they can be truthful with us and we can support them in having a great life. So that's how I feel about gaming. What about you, Rachel?
I agree with all of that wholeheartedly. I love that we're so aligned on the messaging on this issue of technology. Like we talked about it a little bit in our last podcast episode together. And I know like we will often kind of be cheering each other on Instagram when we talk about it too. I think that it's really important and perfectly integrates into this conversation on critical thinking that we try to honor our children's needs and learn from our children, like really kind of set aside the fears that we have and the anxieties that come up for us. So here's what I see happen. Anxiety will show up for a parent and that feeling is uncomfortable. And so what they will do to try and make that feeling go away is control their children's behaviors, to make the technology go away, to turn it off so that that feeling of anxiety goes away. But really, I would love to invite people that when that feeling of anxiety shows up, to sit with it and get to know it and be grateful for it. Thank you for inviting me to check in on whether or not I feel like this is a value add for my child and for our family. So what I'm going to do with that invitation to check in is get really curious. I'm going to observe my child. I'm going to get to know what it is that they're getting out of this experience. I'm going to look into more of what the research is actually telling us about screens and children. And I'm going to be open-minded to some of the benefits that might come from it. And if I decide that there is some way in which it is not serving my child, I'm going to come to them in collaboration and say, hey, this is what I've noticed. Like, have you noticed that? How's that feeling in your body when you're in that experience? And I'm wondering if there's anything that I can do to better support you through that aspect of this gaming experience or this experience with your screens. So it might be like a food issue or doing something outside, moving our bodies together before and after issue, or having a snack break with you in the middle, or, whatever it is. As part of like the bucket system course, we have this seasonal collaboration session. And part of that is like, I come to my kids and say like, how can I support you through like these different needs and challenges that I'm noticing in this season? And we collaborate around ideas for that. And it almost always includes technology, including a refresh. So like I seasonally change out the apps on their iPad or get them a new game. So we might say like, hey, this aspect of this app like isn't feeling great for you, or this part of it is feeling hard for you, I found this other app that I think like might help you work on that, or might help you build the skills in that particular area. What do you think? Do you want to try it? And so again, just coming to them in collaboration when there are things that you notice they could use some extra support for, which is like you said, that whole like replacing thing. Your kids are showing up in these digital spaces because they're getting some serious needs met from it, in large part because we're blocking off like real world experiences from them. So for example, if this digital world is where they are connecting socially and they're finding their people, how can you help them to find their people and build up some of those social skills in the real world? How can you help them with that? So before even thinking about pulling away or blocking access or removing things, we have to think about what we can add in for these kids to get some of these very real needs met that we're kind of artificially denying them access to so often in the real world.
Oh, that is a beautiful place to end our conversation, Julie. Thank you so much for coming back on the show and talking to us about critical thinking. Tell us a little bit about the book and where we can connect with you even more deeply.
So the book is available everywhere, in bookstores, online, Amazon, obviously, Barnes & Noble, all the places. You can go to raisingcriticalthinkers.com, and there are all the buttons there for you. There's also a free downloadable book club guide. So I really recommend people read this book in a group, because you'll have such great, big, juicy conversations and lend each other support. And that book club guide gives you, good pages to take notes on and questions to ask. So that's for you for free. I'm most active personally on Instagram. My account is @JulieBraveWriter. And then we also have Brave Writer accounts on Twitter, Pinterest. We have a blog, Facebook, all those other usual suspects.
All the things.
That's right.
Well, thank you again so much, Julie. This conversation has been so enriching to me personally, so I know it's going to be enriching to everyone else listening. And you'll just have to keep writing more books so we have more excuses for you to keep coming back on.
Oh, I look forward to it. I love talking to you, Rachel. And I did want to just throw in right at the end, because I forgot to mention it, but bravewriter.com is the company that I own that teaches writing and language arts to homeschooling families and parents who do supplemental schooling for their kids. Thank you for having me. I just love everything about you.
Yes, and on that Brave Writer note, for those of you who heard what I said earlier about my two oldest starting school, Brave Writer was part of how they scaffolded into that academic world. So there's my
fabulous.
endorsement for
Love
that.
hearing that. Fabulous. Thank you so much.